Hi, this is Dingus Khan. Welcome back to the third video in my series called KI Tech Tips, where I give advice on various different characters that I play in tech. This is the third video in the series. I've saved for the best for last, Eyedol. Eyedol is the character that I play the most. I have two mains technically, Eyedol and Jago, but I play Eyedol the most in tournament, and I reserve Jago in tournament for counter picks. I would say he's the character that I have the most knowledge in, so it was quite difficult to discern what kind of tech video I want to make. And then I realized that a year ago, I had a thought to make an Eyedol guide, and I wrote out a script, and for some reason I just didn't do it, most likely due to the fact that I had quite a lot of coursework at the time, and I just couldn't balance it. And now, I am graduated, and it's the summer, so now I have some time to make an Eyedol guide. So that will be my replacement for the tech video. This guide is primarily meant for people who are somewhat familiar with fighting game concepts and mostly familiar with KI concepts. So if you have a pretty okay idea of how to play KI and balance its mechanics like shadow countering, counter breakers, and most importantly the combo system, then that's good. And as well as having a basic grasp on fighting game concepts, such as meeting and frame traps and navigating neutral and things like that, then this guide is definitely for you. This is going to go over some basic concepts with Eyedol. It's going to go over his frame data and his normals, his movement, as well as a general game plan, and then pros and cons for playing the character. Infil has some listed on his ki.info.net site, which if you're a new player, I vastly recommend. I think it's an invaluable resource. But I don't believe his pros and cons for this character quite fit the character as well as they should, so I'm going to be making my own. And yeah, this will be the Eyedol guide, and first we're going to go over his movement. So I figured before we go into movement, we should just go over the basics of how Eyedol works. Eyedol is an RNG stance character whose stances heavily rely on each other to get better. The stance I'm in right now is called Warrior Body. That is the Rushdown stance, but the other stance is called Mage Body, and that is the Zoning stance. They are independent of each other, and you cannot switch between them at will. However, you have a random chance to switch between them after medium and heavy normals, specials, and this little thing here, Head Punch, and also Enders. What Head Punch does is that it gives you a random chance to switch right there and then. However, even though I got it on the first try there, it's not always 1. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it can even be 4 chances to switch, but it's never more than 4. You cannot switch between them manually, mostly because if you could, you'd be busted. Part of the challenge of Eyedol is that you're not always going to be in the right body when you want to be. However, the head switch does have 7 frames of invulnerability, so sometimes it's actually worth it to just have the random head switch. And like I said earlier, they heavily rely on each other, and that's due to the pip function. So down here in the bottom UI in the left-hand corner, you can see that I have 3 pips built for Warrior. And how you build pips for Warrior is that in Mage Head, you do a certain command normal that on hit builds 1 pip each. And his way to build pips is called Telestrike, where he teleports to the opponent in about a 32 frame startup. If he hits them, he builds the pip, which looks like this. That is a neutral teleport, and that is just neutral 3 kicks, all 3 kicks. You can also do 4 Telestrike, and that teleports behind the opponent and sends them the other way. You can also do back Telestrike, but that is a reversal that I'll talk about later. And what this allows Warrior to do is that it allows him to cancel out of his normals and specials. For example, you can do that. I just canceled the normal into another normal. Or you can do, that was a mistake, you can do that, and as you can see, it comboed on hit. Or you can do, for example, this overhead, and then into the low. What this does is that it makes Warrior's offense, which is otherwise kind of linear and very based on strike throw into very unpredictable. It also allows him to get in a lot better. Like, for example, you just saw me doing shoulder into another shoulder. But however, I could also do shoulders to get in from like mid-screen, and then I could cancel into a jump or a dash to make strike throw, or I can go on the left side and do a knee jump low, or I can do a cross up normal, or I can stay in front. And this kind of pip game for Warrior is the crux of Eyedol's offense, and is the key to being a good Eyedol player. And I'm going to give some tips at the end of how to use it effectively and be a good Eyedol player. Mage pips are done by doing this thing here. That is just all 3 punches, and it's a command grab. It's called Crushing Roar. It does 4%, I believe? No, 3%. It does 3% damage. It's +4 on hit. It is like 9 frame startup for the neutral version. And it is generally pretty good. There is also a back version, which he does a little back step. And he also has a forward version. And you can cancel into it from normals. Like, for example, let's say Jago here is blocking because he has godlike defense. You can do stand heavy punch and then do a forward version. But if you want to set up a tick throw, you're usually going to be using the forward version. Like, for example, if I do this, it's not going to combo. No matter how much I want it to, it just won't. As much as I wish it did. So it sets up some pretty nasty tick throws, but it also builds pips for his other body. And what this does is that it enhances his special moves, which I'll talk about later, but I'm just going to go over the pip versions now. For example, his quarter circle back kicks is his stomp, which I don't know why I keep missing that quarter circle back, but I do it twice. If I do it twice, you get that version. There's also different versions for his strengths. If I want to do meteor strike, which is quarter circle back and punch, if I do it twice, I get a better version. And if I want to do bolt strike, if I press it twice, I get all 3 versions of it. And that is pretty good for space control and stuff. And also gives an extra plus frames on his stomp. And for the meteors, it helps set up setups and stuff. I would not say that mage pips are as useful as warrior pips, but again, using them effectively is like the key to being a really good Eyedol player. And it's something that a lot of Eyedol players do not utilize, which I'll talk about a little later again. But if you want to be a good Eyedol player, you gotta go over it. You gotta master it. Alright, now for the movement. Warrior is a rushdown hit, as I mentioned before, so his movement is really good. His walk speed is pretty fast. He's a very good jump. It's not floaty at all, which is unusual. This is kind of similar to Aghanos' jump, is that in that even though he's a big body, his jump arc is like really ridiculous. A lot of people complain about Eyedol jump arc because it's so hard to anti-air, and because his hitbox is so weird, like as you can see in the air, it doesn't even go extend to his legs, so he's very difficult to anti-air. And that is also a good part of Eyedol defense, Eyedol offense. Like for example, you can do a shoulder, and you can cancel into a jump, which is hard to anti-air, and you can do a cross-up, and that's kind of how that works. However, Mage's movement is not nearly as good. His jump is a lot floatier, so you can't take advantage of it. His walk speed is extremely slow. His dash is a little bit slower, but that's okay because he is the zoning body. He is not meant to rush you down. He wants you to stay away from him and build chip damage and build pips. But however, if Mage is close and has advantage, he can do some pretty good pressure, which I'll get into a little bit later. So that is the movement for the 2 stances. Now we're going to go over his normals. Specifically, we're going to go over his universal normals, and that is normals shared between the 2 stances. They do have some unique normals, which I'll talk about later. Those are his medium punches and his heavy punches. But for now, we're going to go over his universal normals. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the universal normals that Eyedol has, and these are buttons that are shared between stances. They have the exact same frame data between bodies, so if I happen to change between explaining one of them, it's actually no big deal because their purpose pretty much remains the same. The shared buttons that Eyedol has are his light punches, his light kicks, his medium kicks, and his heavy kicks. And we'll start with the light punches. A while ago, maybe a few years ago, if you asked me what I thought about these 2 normals, I would have said they're completely useless because they're minus on block, and they have a fair amount of pushback. But I think the pushback is actually what makes these normals fairly useful, specifically crouch light punch. You can do this to create a lot of space for yourself when you want to, and it also creates a fairly good spacing trap. Like for Warrior, for example, I can do, and that's hard to challenge. I can chain 2 of them, and that's going to be super hard to challenge, because, as I'll explain later, that button that I just used at the end there, his stand medium punch, is 6 frames, and for a medium that's so big, that's extremely good. So it's going to be really hard to challenge that. Also, for example, if I'm in mage form and someone is on me, but they've decided to read like a Telestrike or a Reversal or something, and I just want them to get away from me, I can do 2 of those and do a stand medium punch, same thing. And that's going to create a lot of space for myself if I need to. It's also going to create a really good spacing trap. So whilst I don't think stand light punch is particularly useful just because it shares a lot of the negative attributes of crouch light punch, it doesn't have the pushback. So crouch light punch is actually really good, I believe. Stand light kick. Stand light kick is extremely good, but it shares basically like the opposite function of crouch light punch. While it is 5 frames, the same as the light punches, it is +2 on block, but it has fairly low pushback and fairly low range. So this is definitely not a button for poking, but it's actually a button to set up close range pressure and frame traps. It will counter hit confirm into itself. Maybe I'll show that off now. And if someone tries to mash through it, it is a frame trap, so it is fairly useful for close range pressure. It will also frame trap into specifically Warrior's other buttons, like the medium punches specifically, or maybe even if you want to create more space. If you want to create space safely, you can also just do crouch light punch afterwards again. So this is a fairly good button for staying in. As I saw before, as fairly low pushback, so you can do that up to 3 times in a row if you're point blank on a character with a thinner hurt box, like Jaygos. You will be in range for a tick command throw the entire time, because Eyedol's command throw is extremely large in range, and you will be in range for a tick throw for up to 1 or 2. But if you want to get a normal throw after a 3rd one, you're going to have to walk up a little bit, but that's perfectly fine. So this button is really good for tick throws and frame traps and keeping the pressure on your opponent and making sure they don't mash out. I cannot be so positive of crouch light kick though. This is a 6 frame button. It is very minus on block while not punishable. For a light, this is pretty bad. It is not chainable into itself. It does not create a lot of pushback, so it's not great for that purpose either. The only positive that it really has is that Eyedol's other low, crouch medium kick, is -6 on block, which is technically punishable if your opponent reacts to you not canceling into anything. So this is a slightly safer low just to do raw. But even then, I don't really think it has that much use because your opponent can react to the recovery and challenge if they want to, which makes it fairly unsafe in that regard. So while it is safe technically to just kind of throw out, it is fairly useless just because of the existence of his much longer ranged crouch medium kick, which I guess I'll talk about now. Crouch medium kick is -6 on block. It's a 7 frame medium, which is perfectly standard for mediums. What makes this medium particularly good has a fair amount of range. As you can see, I'm hitting Jago away from like this distance, so if you're fairly close and your opponent is backing up, this is a really good way to catch them from backing away from you. Eyedol also has a plethora of plus specials, so this is going to be really good for catching people from walking back or just making people block and going into a fairly plus special like Heavy Destroyer or Heavy Stomp. So it's good for making people stay still and not backing away from you. However, it is -6 on block, which makes it technically unsafe to do raw. So you're usually going to be canceling into something. I have found that occasionally players who are ready for this will expect to shadow counter after the crouch medium kick. So if you can bait the shadow counter, you'll definitely have enough time after recovery of crouch medium kick to punish the shadow counter. But that is a fairly risky strategy I like to employ it because it does generally work on a lot of people, but on an opponent that's going to be ready to punish your crash medium kick if you do it raw, or at least challenge your crash medium kick if you do it raw, you wouldn't want to do that normally. But it is a fairly good low otherwise, even though it's fairly minus. It has a lot of range. So, as I said before, if you want people to stay still and hold your plus pressure, this is a good way to do that. Stand medium kick. Stand medium kick is a good button. It's a slow-ish medium. I think it's 7 or 8 frame startup. It is -1 on block, but as you can see, it is extremely large, especially for a medium button. This is like huge. That's not like one of Mage's buttons. You know what? I'll just punch in the Mage just to show you. This is Mage's projectile stand medium punch, and this is his stand medium kick. So it is actually fairly good for just a normal stand medium kick. I don't usually use it that often just because the normal specific the body specific normals that Eyedol has just tend to be a little bit better. But it is actually a decent poke in the neutral. So again, if you want to cancel into something plus, or just want to cancel into, something safe in the mid screen, this is actually a fairly good option to do that. Okay, so now we have his heavy kicks. I'll start with stand heavy kick. There are a few pros and a few cons to this button. The pros are obviously that it is massive, it is 0 on block, so this is absolutely unpunishable. You can cancel into any one of his plus normals. In the corner, this is actually fairly good pressure because it is so hard to challenge if you space yourself out, even as a warrior. Your opponent might be expecting the shadow counter, but it's not the same as situation as crash medium kick because it is only 0 on block. So this is a fairly good either defensive tool if you want to use people, you want to stop people from walking right into you. This is a good button to tell them stop. I'm controlling my space. And it is a good offensive poke, especially in the corner. The only negatives to this button is that, firstly, it is 10 frame startup, which is slightly longer startup for a heavy, which the standard is 9 frames. But also the cancel window on stand heavy kick is very unlenient. There are buttons that certain characters have that you can kind of late cancel out of and hit confirm on their own. However, this is only really the case for stand heavy kick. If you hit it on counter hit, it is fairly plus on counter hit. But if you just do this in the neutral and you hit them just from like jumping or something, or not counter hitting them at all, you're going to want to preemptively cancel because the cancel window on stand heavy kick is fairly slow. You're going to have to do it preemptively. But otherwise, this is a really good offensive poke and defensive poke as well. It also is fairly plus if you run cancel it using a warrior pip. So if you manual it and then run cancel, you can pretty much manual anything you want afterwards because it is so plus. So it is good for that purpose as well. This is overall a very strong stand heavy kick, a very strong heavy normal, even though it was a little bit slower and the cancel window is a little bit smaller. And then we have sweep. Sweep, it's a fairly standard sweep. It's -4 on block. I think it's 9 or 10 frame startup. It has a little bit of pushback, which is pretty good. People are not going to be punishing you for using this in the mid screen. If you just kind of want people off of you, this is not really a bad option for that at all. This is it's not punishable, obviously, it's only -4. And of course, it is a fairly standard sweep. It does have a lot of range too. Like, as you can see, I just hit Eyedol from like a gajillion years away. So if you're trying to catch people again from walking back, you just kind of want them to stay still for a little bit and stay on the floor, because obviously it's a hard knockdown. It will cause, I think, like 52 frames of knockdown. Then this is really good for that purpose as well. It's a fairly standard sweep, but it is one of the better sweeps. I'm especially thankful for it, especially because there are sweeps like Jago's sweep, which is like -8 on block, but technically punishable. So this is, although it's kind of standard, it is definitely one of the better sweeps. So those are all of Eyedol's universal normals. Next, I'll be covering, all in one section, I'll be covering the body-specific normals. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the specific normals that are assigned to each body. Those are the medium punches and the heavy punches for each body, as you can see. Okay, so we'll start with Warrior. So these two buttons here, stand medium punch and crouch medium punch, these are the crux of warrior offense, I feel. They are 6 frames of startup. They have extremely long range for a normal. They are +1, so if you do a frame trap like crouch medium punch into stand medium punch, it is a true frame trap because the second medium punch will win out due to priority if they hit a 5-frame normal and a 5-frame light. It also counter hit confirms into each other, and if you have extremely good execution, you can consistently just link them into each other, which is actually super wild, especially for normal, all like this. But I'll just show it off for the sake of. Look at that, that's fucking crazy. The main difference between these two buttons is that one has a slightly longer recovery than the other. I believe one has 14 frames of recovery and one has 18 frames of recovery. I believe that is the standing medium punch that has more recovery. But otherwise, the frame data is exactly identical. Because they have so little pushback, because they have such a long range, because it's so plus, and because the startup is so fast, this is Warrior's best button, and I would argue this is one of the best normals in the game. And it's definitely one of the best mediums in the game, arguably the best medium in the game. It is so good at pressuring your opponent from short to mid-range distance away. This is an extremely good counter poke defensively. This is extremely good offensively if you want to frame trap your opponent and stay in there. You will be in range for a tick command throw pretty much any time. You'll be in range to cancel into one of your plus normals. This is Crushing Destroyer specifically that you're going to use. It is also fairly plus on run cancel. This is an extremely good button. If you're ignoring this button as an Eyedol player, you are doing something wrong. This button is so good. You should be using it in the neutral whenever you can, as long as you don't get too predictable with it. It is the crux of warrior offense. It is by far one of his best buttons. Now we have stand heavy punch. This is a 9-frame heavy. It will also counter hit confirm to these medium punches. It is kind of actually fairly similar to the strengths of stand medium punch, except it is slightly slower and has a little bit more range than crouch medium punch, although it's actually not by that much. If you are especially diligent and you can catch your opponent like blocking too much, you can do like a lot of medium punches in a row and then do stand heavy punch and continue your pressure that way, which is extremely good. You can also just like cancel into like plus normal if you need to, or plus special. It is fairly similar to stand medium punch and crouch medium punch in its strengths, but it is overall slightly longer. This is for if you want to catch people just like from a slightly longer distance away from you, but it is slightly slower. And that is that for now. Warrior also has, that is that for stand heavy punch I meant. Warrior does also have a command normal, and so does Mage, which we'll get into in a little bit. His crouch heavy punch, it's okay. I don't find myself using this normal too often because Warrior has a better anti-air in the form of his DP, but otherwise this is not bad at all for an anti-air. Its range is not really that good. Maybe you might want to use this as a recap in the corner. As far as that goes, like if you are in the corner and you have a juggle going, maybe you'll just use this to keep the juggle going. But it's okay. If you want to anti-air, I would do light DP instead, which is much faster. It's 5-frame startup, and it's fairly good anti-air in that sense. So while it's okay, it's not the best button ever. Now we're going to go to his specific command normal, which is forward heavy punch. It's Clobber. It is 3 hits, and it is a forward advancing move. It takes him extremely far, as you can see. If you could believe this shit, it is 0 on block if you do this raw, so it is completely safe to just throw out there. It is also his max damage normal, so if you want to punish someone for DPing, then your max punish is technically this. And as you can see, that did 14%, which is fairly good. Or you can sacrifice a little bit of damage for less KB and do this instead. So it is his optimal damage starter opener for starters. The main weakness of this normal is that it can be shadow countered fairly easily because it is 3 hits. So it is not particularly safe if the opponent has meter because it can be so easily reacted to. But a strategy that I find that is pretty good, and that you'll see a lot of idle players do too, is let's just get, like, if you're expecting your opponent can shadow counter, then you can do, you can cancel out of it early, or you can even do 1 hit, and you can bait the shadow counter. I find that is an extremely good method to keep this normal safe. You don't really want to run cancel it on hit, just because you can just go into a special and get your damage that way. But otherwise, this is an extremely obnoxious normal just because of how far it goes, just because of how safe it is. And if the opponent doesn't have a meter, they have to be looking for this in the neutral to block it just because of how far it takes them. But of course, the only major disadvantage is that if they have meter, this is going to be very easily shadow counterable, especially if you don't have a pip or instinct. It's actually especially good because if you bait a shadow counter and you have instinct, you're going to get a lot of damage. And I'll talk about the benefits of Eyedol Instinct a little bit. So let's move on to the mage specific normals. So here are his medium punches. They are projectile normals. As I said, all of mage, I don't know if I said this before, but all of mage's specific normals are all projectiles. They have a completely disjointed hitbox, so this cannot be whiff punished by traditional means. So it has extremely long range, as you notice, but it's not really that safe on block. However, you're going to be canceling this into a button most likely, and of course, and it's not punishable if you space it. Of course, crouch medium punch is fairly similar to stand medium punch. It's just that the range is just a little bit longer, I believe. And oh no, it is actually okay, that's something I just learned. Stand medium punch is slightly more range, and stand medium punch is a little bit more recovery, I believe. So stand medium punch just seems better overall, and I keep switching here for some reason. So this is a fairly good button overall. It's a fairly good poke. As I said before, mage is a zoner, so you're going to want keeping your opponent at bay, and stand medium punch is a fairly good button to do that. Let's go into the stand heavy punch. Stand heavy punch is arguably mage's best button. It looks like this. As you can see, that just hit from an ungodly distance away. As I said, it's a projectile normal. It will hit into his bolt strike from a fairly long distance away. You can pressure people from like mid-screen at this if you do meteor strike, and if they're not ready, then it's going to be really hard to punish. This is an extremely good poke overall. It cancels and links perfectly into his specials. It is fairly good for pressuring the opponent, even in the corner. If you have them in the corner and they don't have meter, this is extremely hard to challenge. The only problem is that, of course, all of mage's specific normals are projectiles. So if the opponent is looking for them, they can blow through them if they want. Then we have Crouch Heavy Punch. Crouch Heavy Punch is kind of weird because it's not a very traditionally good normal. It is 14 frames of startup, so you might be thinking, okay, maybe this is really good for anti-airs, especially because it's a projectile hitbox. But you really have to be anticipating the jump, and you really have to react super early just because it's so slow. However, it does have one kind of specific niche use, which I'll show off now. Yeah, as you can see, you can juggle into Telestrike with this button because it launches them a fair distance away. So if you really want them away for some reason, and if you want to get not punish, but if you want to send them far away and you just want to create space, this is not a bad button for it. However, this can be broken after an ender because it is a normal after an ender. So take that as you will. As I noticed before, it can combo to Telestrike, but there is a more optimal way to combo into Telestrike, which I'll show off in a little bit after I go over his specials. And then we have Mage's specific command normal, which is Back Medium Punch. This looks ridiculous, but I don't think it's actually that crazy. It used to be a little bit better, actually, because this button used to be cancelable, which is crazy. But overall, it's not actually well, let me rephrase. It's not as good as it used to be, but it is still pretty good. You're mainly going to be using this for people that jumping at you at mid-screen. Of course, Mage makes a lot of people antsy, so they're going to be jumping at you a lot and trying to get in. But this is really good for swatting people away. This is especially good for characters like Omen, which are going to set up orbs and try to like glide in at you from a fair distance away. You can just like swat them away. And let me try to show this off here. As you can see, if I set the opponent to jump, and I just time it right, it sends them a fair distance away. So that is what that is good for. Mage is primarily a zoner, so all of his buttons kind of exemplify keeping the opponent a fair distance away. So that is all of the body-specific normals done. Okay, so unfortunately I have realized that I missed some of the normals. Specifically, I missed all of the jump normals, so I'm just going to go over that really quickly. Eyedel's universal jump normals: stand light kick, stand medium kick, stand heavy kick, are his universal jump normals. All of the kick buttons, and also the jump light punch. They are actually better on different different bodies. And what I mean by that is, let me just start with jump light kick. Jump light kick, I never see Eyedol players use this, and for kind of good reason. If you want to do a normal really low to the ground, then jump light kick is probably the button you want to use, but it doesn't really cross up, as far as I know. The hitbox is fairly thin. It's not really a great jump normal. What is a really good jump normal is this: jump medium kick. Jump medium kick is especially good on Warrior Body because Warrior Body's jump arc is so not floaty and fast falling and tight. It has a tremendous hitbox. It is very easy to cross up. You will often see Eyedol players, like for example, if they have something blocked, they will cancel out of it and go into a jump normal. This jump medium kick is extremely critical for Warrior pip cancels. Because it is so obnoxiously good. You can also stay in front, and of course it's fairly good. Just because this is such a large normal, and because it is so good on Warrior Body, it is extremely good. However, on Mage Body, it's just not as good because it's a little bit floatier. However, if you do want a really big normal to use, then of course, if you want to jump in on someone, then jump medium kick, probably the way to go. You also have jump heavy kick. Jump heavy kick is actually what I believe to be just a little bit smaller than jump heavy kick. Jump medium kick, unless I'm losing my mind here. It can cross up in very specific circumstances, like if you're jumping at someone in front a lot and they think, oh, okay, just as a jump medium kick is just a button that you're supposed to use to catch people from walking away from you in front. You can also do a cross up on it, and if you're really tight. Overall, the best universal jump normal for Eyedol is his jump medium kick. You're going to want to be using this all the time, and Eyedol players do use this all the time. And I'm going to actually be talking about why it's actually maybe even overused at the end of the video, where I give advice on how to effectively utilize Eyedol and what mistakes you can avoid versus playing him and playing as him as well. So those are all of his jump normals that are universal. Let's go over the jump normals that are body specific. Okay, so as previously stated, his jump normals that are body specific are his medium punch and his heavy punch. Jump medium punch is pretty good just for like trying to catch people as an air-to-air first of all, and just actually as jumping in on people as well. People are going to be expecting this button, but if you use this button, maybe you'll catch them off guard a little. It's fairly decent. If you want to hit someone a little bit lower to the ground without using jump medium kick, this is not a bad button to do that. You can like jump over people's like expected normal range and hit this button if you want. Get them to stay still as well in the air. But overall, if you ask me what's better, jump medium kick or jump medium punch, I would definitely say jump medium kick, even though jump medium punch on Warrior Body is not bad. And then you have jump heavy punch. Jump heavy punch is unique because it causes a ground bounce, and you can actually use this to start a lot of your juggles in warrior form. It is also very obnoxious to use just because, even though it's kind of slow, its hitbox is actually somewhat large. You can hit someone like fairly up high in the air. If a lot of Eyedol players will use this just to kind of like get people to stand still. And if they don't stand still, then they're going to get bopped and juggle is going to start, which they might not want, of course. So it's not bad for that purpose. If you want a button that's just going to start a juggle right away, like maybe you just want a bunch of wall carry, this is definitely one you're going to use. So it's definitely not bad at all. Now we have mage-specific buttons. These are Jump Medium Punch and Jump Heavy Punch. Jump Medium Punch is good specifically because it sends opponents a really long distance away. It used to be super ridiculous because it used to send Eyedol an extremely long distance away, but now it's just a little hop away. If I set the opponent to jump, you'll see it in action. Like if you want an opponent off you right now, then Jump Medium Punch is an especially good button to use for that purpose. And then you have Jump Heavy Punch, Mage Jump Heavy Punch, and this is a button that is used to harass people. It is -3 on block, but it's usually not punishable, unless your opponent is like a DP master or something. It is a projectile normal, so it is especially hard to anti-air. It is an overhead, of course, even though for some reason it doesn't feel like one, even though it's a jumping normal. You can use it fairly low to the ground if you need to. This is generally a button that I use to make people stop approaching me in neutral. If I want to create some space, I can just use this button. And because it's a projectile normal, and because the hitbox is so large, you're going to get people to stop people in their tracks. You can also just use it as a close-range harassment tool. Just like if you want to annoy them and you want to get them antsy, just throw in a couple of these. I guarantee they're going to be annoyed. Especially on characters with larger hurt boxes, this is an especially annoying normal. So to recap, this normal primarily used to sending people away. This normal primarily used to stop people dead in their tracks from approaching you, and to create some annoyance and some frustration in the opponent. So those are his jumping normals, just to get that out of the way. So Eyedol specials are all extremely good, and we're going to start with warriors. We will start with Eyedol's best special in my opinion, which is Crushing Destroyer. It is a 2-hit swing that Eyedol does at the opponent. It is quarter circle forward punch, and this is extremely good for a number of reasons. Starting with Light Destroyer, Eyedol players will just call this thing like the neutral winning special. It is extremely fast. It is a true block string, so you cannot just like DP or parry through it, which is the common problem with Medium Destroyer and Heavy Destroyer, is that if your opponent is ready for it, they can parry through it with a Sako or DP through it with specific characters like Cinder. But for Light Destroyer, that is not an issue at all. It is 2 hits, so it is shadow counterable, but it is fairly hard to shadow counter if you're not familiar with it. The range on Light Destroyer is absolutely massive. You can just keep doing it, and it is extremely difficult for some characters to actually challenge properly. In addition, it is only -1 on block, the light version. So this is just an extremely obnoxious neutral tool. You can use it to check people approaching you. You can use it over and over again on the people in the corner, and people are not going to be able to challenge you as well. You can just throw it out in the neutral if your opponent is close enough, and it'll probably hit them if you're not being careful. Light Destroyer is just an absolutely invaluable tool, and you're going to want to be making use of it when you're in the neutral. And if you're not close enough for like Stand Medium Punch or Stand Heavy Punch or something, this drastically improves Warrior Eyedol's neutral, and it's already really good. The only time that you really shouldn't do this is if your opponent has meter and they're ready to shadow counter. If that's the scenario, be careful with throwing it out. But if that's not the scenario, abuse this as shit. This is such a good neutral tool. We have Medium Destroyer. Medium Destroyer I feel like is the weakest of the destroyers. It is 0 on block. This is where it starts becoming easier to blow through it, or this is where it starts becoming possible to blow through it. As I noticed before, the Sako players can parry between the 2 hits of Medium and Heavy Destroyer, and Cinder, for example, can DP through the hits of Medium and Heavy Destroyer. But otherwise, it's definitely, it shares all the same strengths of Destroyer. It's massive. The Medium version is 0 on block. It's just extremely good in general. Also, you have Heavy Destroyer. Heavy Destroyer is the slowest of the destroyers, but it is +1 on block. So this is extremely good for extending pressure. Like, for example, you might see me do like a frame trap here, like that kind of pressure string, and that's possible because Heavy Destroyer is +1 on block, and his medium buttons are 6 frames, so that is also a true frame trap. As I'll discuss later, this does lead him open to being shadow countered in general, as you might have noticed as a theme. but we're going to talk about it at the end of the video. Heavy Destroyer is just a way to extend your pressure. If your opponent is enough meter, this is just a free way to get plus frames. It's a completely ridiculous special. It is also at the crux of Warrior offense. It is extremely good. You're going to want to be making advantage of this all the time if your opponent isn't ready to shadow counter it. But if they are ready to shadow counter it, just be aware of that. Like for example, you can bait it just by poking in the neutral its medium punches and waiting for a shadow counter, and maybe you'll catch them trying to, do this early. Overall, extremely good. We have his shoulders. Those are quarter circle back kicks. Like this. They're a shoulder. They're similar to Glacius's shoulder. The thing that makes these good is that, first of all, they're actually not that minus. The light version is only like -2 or something, so it's fairly safe. I believe medium is minus like 5. It goes fairly long distance, has a pretty big hitbox. And then heavy is like minus like 9 or something. The thing about these is that medium is actually slightly better, because even though it goes like a slightly shorter distance, the hitbox on medium is bigger, so it is technically a larger shoulder. But here's the main application for this. You see that? I can do this from like across the screen and stay super safe. Like with something that is -5 or -9 usually on block, is just turned into a free way to get into neutral. It is a completely ridiculous way to just abuse Eyedol's plus frames. This is what I was talking about when I was saying that like Eyedol's heavily dependent on pips and the other heads to get better. Having warrior pips makes Eyedol's neutral completely ridiculous, because you are not safe at any distance, at like basically any distance. Not from like full screen, but from anywhere from like here to like maybe like here. From that, like maybe a little bit closer than that, like here. You are not safe. If warrior has pips, you can use this to get down on your opponents and mix and force a mix up. This is extremely obnoxious, which is kind of the part. This when Warrior Eyedol is played at a peak level, he is just super obnoxious. You should be utilizing warrior pips to make shoulder safe and force the mix-ups to the best of your ability. And then we have his DPs, which I'm just going to turn off block all on for this. So his DP is not a DP motion, it's a quarter circle back punch motion. This is the light version, this is the medium version, and this is the heavy version. The light version is 5 frames, and it is a true invincible reversal. It also, as you can see from the hitbox, has a fairly high hitbox, so this is a really good anti-air as well. But however, it is his only actual true reversal. His other DP, medium DP, has high invuln, but it does not have like mid or low invuln. So it's supposed to be used as an anti-air. But the thing about medium DP as opposed to light DP is that it'll start juggles. So as you can see, we also have Shadow Tune. It is extremely good for starting juggles and anti-airing. If you do it, it's a little bit slower, so you're gonna have to react early if you want to anti-air with this. But it will start a lot of damage, and you do get a lot of reward on anti-airing. And then you have heavy. Heavy has pretty much no invuln, as far as I know, but it recaps. So for example, if you get let's say your opponent is jumping, you get an anti-air, you can dash forward, do it again, and get a recap, which is really good. The only thing is that it is somewhat obvious that it is the heavy version, but that is where you can employ the counter break mind games to get that going. Eyedol, especially in Instinct, can also build up a pretty significant amount of PD, so having heavy DP is actually a pretty good way to do that. The other version, way to get a recap is medium, forward medium punch, which is I kind of neglected to address in the warrior specific normals, but I'll just address that now. It's a fairly slow overhead, it's like 28 frames or something, so it is fairly reactable. But it is fairly plus on hit. Like if you hit this, you can pretty much manual whatever you want. It is just a way to make Eyedol's offense without pips a little bit less linear. It is fairly reactable, but it has like enormous range, and it's only -4 on block. So this is absolutely not punishable if you just throw this out, unless your opponent is ready for it and parries it as if they're Hasako or DPs it on reaction or whatever. So that's the only other way to get a recap otherwise than heavy DP. So to recap that, light DP, you're going to use that as your anti-air and your invincible reversal. Medium, you're going to use that as your anti-air to juggle if you have a little bit of time to react. And heavy DP, you're going to use this to recap and get them on the ground after a juggle. And I'm also going to go over the Shadow versions real quick. Shadow Destroyer, it does 9%. It is your optimal metered starter, along with Shadow Shoulder. If you do a Clobber, that's like 16%. That's actually pretty decent damage. It's not like super high, but it is like above average, I would say. It is plus on block, so similar to Shadow Laser Sword on Jago. If your opponent doesn't have any meter and you want a way to just like extend your pressure, Shadow Destroyer is actually not a terrible way to do that, even though you will lose meter. Just be careful that your opponent doesn't have meter if you're going to do it on block, because obviously it is very reactable and very shadow counterable. We have Shadow Shoulder. You're not going to really be using this in the same way as you're going to be using the other shoulders, because you can't like run cancel or jump cancel using Warrior Pips like in the middle of the animation. You can only do it after the 5 hits. But this is a way to get more corner carry. Like for example, if you're in the middle of the screen and you want to get to the corner, it gives you a bunch of corner carry, and as you can see, it does the same amount of damage as Shadow Crushing Destroyer. So if you want corner carry and you want damage, Shadow Shoulder is the way to go in your optimal, getting as much damage as you can and getting them as close to the corner as you can. That's the balance between choosing Shadow Destroyer and Shadow Shoulder. Shadow Shoulder is generally better. However, it doesn't really have the same neutral applications that Shadow Destroyer has. And then you have a Shadow DP. Shadow DP causes a ground bounce. This is another way to cash out damage. So, for example, as you can see, it did just cash out there. So even though it doesn't recap, it causes a ground bounce and it cashes out. In Instinct, Shadow DP takes on a whole another application, which I'll talk about when we get to Instinct. But overall, Shadow DP is just a fairly good way to cash out some damage. It is also invulnerable, so when I said that Light DP is his only invulnerable DP, Light DP is his only unmetered invulnerable DP. A Shadow DP is actually totally invulnerable. But of course, I would just do Light DP. I don't think there's any reason to spend the meter unless you really, really need the damage for whatever reason. So those are Warrior specials. Now we'll go on to Mage. Sorry for the abrupt transition. I just felt like I should reshoot this part of the video where I explain the Mage specials, just because I shot it before previously, right next to the Warrior special explanation, and I don't feel like I did a very good job. So now I'm going to be redoing it. I'll just explain Mage's specials, a general purpose for each one, the Pip versions and the Shadow versions. And the first one I'm going to go over is Light Bolt Strike. Light Bolt Strike is a full screen low. You primarily use this to check people's movement if they're dashing at you or approaching you, and you can convert into Telestrike from it at basically full screen. As you can see, it links into itself, and it does have a somewhat tight link on Telestrike, but you can get it fairly easily with some practice. You can get either version if you want. See, that's a true combo. That's the primary purpose of Light Bolt Strike. Medium Bolt Strike is primarily used to knock people out of the air. All of the Bolt Strike animations have the same amount of startup, I believe something like 22 frames. And the medium version is primarily used to knock people out of the air from a long distance away. You can primarily set this up when an opponent is looking out for low Bolt Strike and wants to avoid it by jumping, but you can catch them out of the air and convert into Telestrike again. So I'm just going to set the opponent to jump. You see, sometimes it will blow out though. As you can see there, I hit like the lower end of Jago's hurt box, like where his legs are. And if you hit that low, then you're not going to be able to get the conversion. conversion. But if I try to hit a little higher, there we go. If you try to hit towards the center of the opponent's hurt box, then you can get a conversion into Telestrike, or either Telestrike basically. Heavy Telestrike is different from that in that it's not a full screen projectile. It just sends a cage around Eyedol's body, and this has 3 primary uses. The first one is similar to medium Telestrike in that it's a call out for people jumping at you, but instead of from far away to avoid Light Bolt Strike, it's primarily for people to be close to you, and you can convert off of Telestrike here too. Another use for it is that you can catch people teleporting at you, which I can't show off right now because I have Jago here. But if you were to preemptively or somewhat preemptively do this for a Fulgor or Spinal, you'll be able to catch their teleports. The other use this has is that it is his optimal combo starter, or optimal opener. So as you can see, if I do Stand Heavy Kick into Heavy Stomp Strike, it only does 10% and builds about 35 kV. But if I do this, it does 11% and builds 33 kV. So not only is it less kV, so you can do more stuff in your combo, but it also does a little bit more damage. But however, you will have to manual afterwards, but it's so plus you can basically just manual whatever you want. You can even manual if you wanted to another Volt Strike. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but it's something you can do. In addition, it's just kind of like a fairly good tool to juggle with as well. Let me show off something here, which I'll explain a little bit after I do Light Meteor Strike, or when I explain Light Meteor Strike. But there we go. As you can see, that is actually the optimal way to go into Telestrike after a Stomp Strike ender. You do Heavy Bolt Strike, you do Light Meteor Strike, and then you do Telestrike. And as you can see, there is a theme of strikes in Mage's special move names. Hipped Bolt Strike has a... Oh yeah, no, I totally forgot. Heavy Bolt Strike also has the application of being a pretty good meaty in the corner. So if I just set the opponent to block all here, I'll show it off. If you get the opponent to block the last hit of Bolt Strike only, it's fairly plus. I believe it's like plus 1 or something. And you can do this by doing Heavy Bolt Strike immediately after a forward throw in the corner. Yeah, so as you can see right there, it hit on the last hit there, and that makes it much more plus. Now we have Pip Bolt Strike, which looks like this. You do that by pressing any strength twice for Bolt Strike. For other versions of his Pip specials, you can do different versions of their Pip specials, but for Bolt Strike is always the same. This is primarily used for space control if you're not sure where the opponent is going, but however, it does have one niche use, which I'll show off now. If the opponent is blocking high specifically, then for some reason it will just build a massive amount of meter and a massive amount of chip damage. So let me just waste a couple of bars here, just to show off how much meter you can also gain from this. You can gain an incredible amount of meter from doing this. In addition, if I set your health regeneration to 0, you can actually see that it builds a lot of chip damage as well. As you can see, that did I don't know, maybe 5 or something % chip damage, which is really ridiculous for a special like this. So even though it's kind of a niche use, it is a use that it has. And now we have Shadow Bolt Strike. Shadow Bolt Strike is a frame 2 full screen projectile reversal. It looks like this. The purpose of this is primarily to get people off of you, because back Telestrike, which is his other reversal, is not very good. It's 32 frame startup and it's easily option selectable, and what that means is that your opponent can do something to prepare for multiple options, or that covers multiple options. In this case, your opponent can meet you with a normal, and usually if the normal is short enough and it's not tough stand heavy punch or something, I will not be hit by it because it'll be moved slightly backwards, but because back Telestrike has so much startup and so much recovery, the opponent will usually recover before you and have time to punish. So Shadow Bolt Strike is kind of Eyedol's get off me tool in that sense. it's much better. It's a much better tool, even though it's not frame 1 invulnerable. So technically, people doing a perfect melee will beat it out. It is full screen though, so this is very hard to fuck up. In addition, Shadow Bolt Strike also has a use of converting off of Light Bolt Strike at certain distances. If I do it like from full screen here, as you'll see, it'll just juggle and it'll be kind of like not very useful. However, if you're a little bit closer, you'll be able to get a grounded combo, which I'll show off now. As you can see, it didn't juggle there, it actually just did a regular grounded combo. And the cool thing about this is that Light Bolt Strike is so plus that you can actually do it from like a fair distance away. Like from here, Shadow Bolt Strike would usually not actually like convert into anything, but I can dash forward and then do it just because it's so plus. So those are the Bolt Strikes explained. Now let's go on to Stomp Strike. Stomp Strike is fairly different from Eyedol's other specials, Eyedol Mage's other specials, just because it's actually used as primarily as a close range special. This is Light Bolt Strike, this is Light Stomp Strike. It has the least range and it's 0 on block. I would not recommend using this generally. It's just not very good when other better options exist in Stomp Strike. You have Medium. This is slightly longer startup, a little bit more range, and it's a little bit more plus. I think it's like +1 on block or something like that. It might be 0 even. And this is Heavy Stomp Strike, which is +3 on block, and it has the most range, but it is the slowest startup. The primary use of this is that you can pressure people up close with a character that is usually not meant to be up close. If I just have the opponent to auto block here, I can just do like... Oh no, let me put it on block all. If I put the opponent on block all here, then you can see how it could be kind of hard to contest. Because it's +3, this is very hard to challenge with certain characters. So you can make very long pressure strings up close with Heavy Stomp Strike. Pip Stomp Strike looks like this. It can look like this, and it can also look like this. The difference there is that I mentioned earlier how with the regular pipped version of Bolt Strike, no matter what you hit, it will always come out the same way, but Mage's pipped Stomp Strikes actually have different versions, which are a little bit more plus on block, depending on what strength you do, but I think the general rule is that it's +5 on block. The only problem with this is that there's a 5-frame gap in between, so your opponent can throw you out of it, or do a 5-frame shadow, or a jab, or a 3-frame DP, or something like that, and it will be a real punish on reaction. It is, I think, reactable as well, so generally you're going to be careful about using this, although if your opponent isn't ready for it, then it's actually a pretty decent way to extend pressure. And then we have Shadow Stomp Strike. It is a full screen projectile, however, I don't really find that it has a lot of use. It does have one kind of like flashy use, which I'll try to show off now. As you can see, that was a real combo into Telestrike. So it's not like super useful, but it's okay. It's not a terribly bad use for it. I would just generally not use it. However, in combos, it does do as much damage, I believe, as Shadow Bolt Strike in combos, when you're actually within a combo. So that's kind of a use for it, I guess. And then we have the Meteor Strikes. This is the Light Strike, this is the Medium, and this is the Heavy. These are all overhead, so you have to block these all high. And this is kind of part of Eyedol's combo game. I mean, not combo game. Part of his pressure game. Like, for example, I just have the opponent to block at the end of the screen here. Then I can do a high, I can do another high, I can switch into warrior form, I can do another high, I can do a low, I can do a low, I can do a high, and then boop, left, right. So even though it's somewhat reactable, it does do a decent amount of chip damage over time if your opponent just chooses to block it out, and you do have a left-right high-low mix-up technically, even though it's all fairly reactable. But it is from full screen, so it's pretty good in that regard. You're going to take what you can get there. The Heavy version is primarily used to set people down, as I just showed you there. Primarily used to keep them blocking and to build chip damage. The medium version is primarily used to catch people from jumping at you and like approaching you from mid-screen. And the light version, I like to use this as a call-out for people jumping from about this distance. It's kind of the same preference of heavy bolt strike. So that if we trade on a jump normal, then I'll be like relatively safe. In addition, it does also have the use of being the optimal way to convert into Telestrike off of a 1 chance, which I'll just show off again just for shitsies, and gigglesies. I couldn't get it there, but you've seen it before. The only thing about that combo is that I think you need something like less than 40 kV for it to work. If you have over 40 kV, or maybe even over 35 kV, then the combo is not going to work. Now we have Pip Meteors. If you tap a strength once, twice, if you tap a strength twice, then you'll be able to get 3 meteors on the strength you tapped. So that was heavy. That was light, medium, and this is heavy. The primary use for this, again, is to keep people blocking, but it's also kind of the best way to set up a mix-up for Telestrike, just because it has so much block stun. But otherwise, not really much use outside of that. And then we have Shadow Meteors. In comparison to normal meteors that are overheads, these are all mids. The main mistake that I see players who are fighting Eyedol for the first time make is that they'll block these high because they'll assume that because the normal meteors are overheads, then the shadow meteors are overheads, but they're not, they're mids. So if you choose to only block this high, then I can throw in a low bolt strike for free. And then you'll just get hit, and I'll push you to the corner, and it'll be bad. So it has that use as well. In addition, what else meteors are good for is pressuring up close. Your opponent is not going to be able to blow through this unless they have a shadow projectile invincible shadow special move. So at a close range, like at the start of the match, this is actually a really good way to build pressure and annoy your opponent because they want to move but they can't, because if they do, they're going to get hit. Unlike the normal meteors, shadow meteors are primarily used for mix-ups. So let's say I get a combo on good old Jago here. So then I set this up, and then I can go left, or I can go right, or I can go low, or I can do another meteor and go high. There's a lot of options that I have there to set up mix-ups during shadow meteors. So to summarize that, shadow meteors are primarily for mix-ups, for left, rights, and high lows, and the standard meteors are used either for space control or to pressure your opponents up close. Bolt Strike is primarily primarily a zoning tool. Meteor Strike can be kind of a mix, and Stomp Strike is primarily a pressuring tool. So I think I've covered all of Major's specials, and now we're going to move on to basically one of the most fun parts of Eyedol, I think, which is his instinct. Sorry, really quick before we go into Instinct, I just want to go over some of the enders and the uses to go over them. I probably should have done that earlier, but, oh well. I'm not going to go super into depth about what you can do with the enders, just because I want to save that maybe for like an advanced Eyedol guide, but I'll go over just like some general concepts that you can do. So, Crushing Destroyer is a ground bounce ender. You primarily do that to set up counter break bait, but you can also do like some actual genuine juggles if the KV is low enough. And in addition, you have some opportunity to do some setups, like for example, if my time is right. Yeah, you can get like a kind of like a left-right there. And if your opponent quick rises, you'll have some time to melee with something like fairly quick, like stand medium punch and crouch medium punch, or the crouch light kicks, or the crouch light punches, or whatever. Or stand light kick, of course. Just something fairly fast that you can use to melee with them. His DP ender is just his damage ender. It is plus 24, plus 25, so you can use this to get damage, but you can also use it just to like actually set up some meaties. Like for example, something that I like is, something like that. I didn't time it right there. Let me just set them to quick rise. Yeah, there we go. That's a meaty that you can get, for example. since it is so consistent, it is the main way you're going to be setting up meaties with Warrior Eyedol. And then we have his shoulder ender. The main purpose of this is that it's basically a free way to get a pip, and obviously you're +4 afterwards, after a command grab. You mainly use this in the corner. You basically never use this mid-screen. So you kind of use it to force a +4 mix-up, depending on what your opponent wants to do afterwards. And now we have the Mage Enders. Stomp Strike Ender is a Juggle Ender. As I showed off there are ways you can convert the Telestrike. If you don't have high enough KV or low enough KV, you can also do this. You can also even just do a regular Telestrike, depending on what you want to do and how much KV you have. It's primarily just a Juggle Ender and to send your opponents away from you and to build pips. Bolt Strike Ender is his meter Ender. It's not very good. I'll try to show it off here if I can set my meter to normal. It doesn't build very much meter, even on level 4. It barely builds any meter. I think I would say it's maybe even a little bit worse than Shatter Ender as far as building meter goes. But it's okay because Warrior Eyedol gets plenty of meter on his own, so he doesn't really need to do that. And Meteor Strike Ender. This is a Mage's damage Ender, which leaves them fairly close on lower KV levels. However, the higher you go, the farther away they'll get. And you can usually get a meaty, or at least Oki as a meteor. It is primarily his damage ender, so you will use it sometimes, but the ender that you most likely want to use most of the time is the Stomp Strike ender, so you can get Telestrike and pips, and you can set up your zoning again. So sorry, that's just the enders out of the way. Now we'll get onto the instinct. So now we're on to basically one of the most fun parts of Eyedol, which is instinct. To be totally honest with you, in Instinct, most of Eyedol's problems totally go away. He becomes basically the best character in the game, I would say. Instinct Eyedol does a lot of things really well, but I think the best thing that he does really well is that he builds a lot of meter, he builds a lot of chip damage, he just does a lot of damage, and he set up mix-ups really well, and we're going to go over all those things. Instinct, he gains access to both of his specials at the same time. For example, if I do Crushing Destroyer, it'll send out a Bolt Strike. If I do Meteors, if I do a DP, it'll send out a Meteor, which is super crazy, because if your opponent doesn't have a projectile invulnerable shadow move, then this is kind of just a somewhat safe DP, if they don't punish it properly. And in Shoulder, I get a Stomp Strike afterwards. And we're just going to go over the brief uses of these quickly. The primary use of this Crushing Destroyer is that it becomes fairly plus, and it builds a lot of Shadow Meteor. So you're going to be doing this to build a lot of chip damage, and it is fairly plus. I believe the most plus version is the medium version, which is +5. This is +3 or something like that. So you're generally going to be using this to build plus frames, build meter, and build chip damage. It is the primary way to stay in your opponent's face during Instinct pressure strings. Shadow Crushing Destroyer, yeah, becomes the most plus, not the most plus, one of the most damaging specials in the game, as I'll show off here. As you can see, that did a ridiculous amount of damage, 14%. So if I do this, this is one of the most punishing openers in the entire game. It just does so much damage, and it also builds a lot of chip damage as well. You primarily use this. It's not actually that plus on block, it's +1 or something, but you can use this to build plus frames fairly easily. And as you said, if your opponent keeps blocking, you can use this to force plus frames as much as you want. And now we have Stomp Strike. Stomp Strike is basically another way to force plus frames. You're kind of noticing a theme here if you've been an astute listener. As you can see, this is fairly plus. You can build extremely long pressure traps with this, and it's going to be really hard to contest. But you might notice that Eyedol's offense is still kind of somewhat linear because of his very slow overhead. However, this is where he really shines. You can do like really plus pressure strings, and then you can use warrior pips to make it more frustrating. So in Instinct and with warrior pips, Eyedol's offense goes from like kind of linear to really hard to block, as you can see there. In addition to being hard to block, Shadow DP is very ridiculous, as I'll show up here. It basically it's a DP, but also it sends meteors all over the place. Some people will use this as an excuse to do like a kind of a safe DP, but however, close up it can be punished by pretty much every character as long as the opponent is close enough to grab you, which is kind of the main way that they'll waste time, like they'll back throw you, and then they'll just block the rest of the meteors, even though Eyedol will probably still be plus afterwards, just because it's like so ridiculously plus. It's kind of like Aghanos chunks, or Shadow chunks. However, I don't really like to use it like that. I actually kind of like to use it as a mix-up tool. So for example, let's just say that I get a hit on Jago here. If I can, there we go. I'll set up meteors somehow, and then I'll just like go to town. I can do kind of whatever I can, basically. The main way to do that is off of ground bounce ender, because we have the most time to set up stuff and set up Shadow DP and meteors. So I kind of like to use it as a one chance. Like I'll go into a one chance into the ground bounce ender. I'll do Shadow DP, and then I'll do my mix up. And then if I open them up again, I'll do a short one chance into ground bounce, which in Instinct is a meter ender. It builds meter as well as being a ground bounce. So I'll get more meter to do Shadow DP again, and they'll go into another mix-up and another one chance. It's really ridiculous like that. Strike. It's not as good as all the other specials, but it's still pretty okay. This is very unique in that it's one of the most breakable shadows in the game. Like for all of that example there, where Eyedol was running at you and then doing a stomp strike, you technically have like 10 chances to break or something like that. So it is one of the most breakable specials in the game. In addition, Shadow Destroyer is actually very breakable as well in this form, because instead of doing like 1, 2, 3, all of the Mold Strike counts as hits, so you can kind of smash it and they'll be very hard to lock out. In addition, it also serves as his shadow counter in this form. So technically, in this form, one of his only weaknesses, basically his only weakness in this form, is that his shadow counter is breakable. But you can set up your own mind games that way as well. To wrap it all up, in this form, Eyedol's offense becomes less linear, and with warrior pips, it becomes downright dangerous. He shits out a bunch of damage, both real damage when he hits you, and chip damage if you block it. And he has a really ridiculous way to set up mix-ups, and he has a really good way to force plus frames and basically all of his specials. So it's basically his turn for the entire time, and if he opens you up, he's going to make it hurt. So that's the primary use of Instinct. So we're nearing the end of the Eyedol guide now. So this will be the second to last section that I do, and I kind of want to talk about things to avoid as an Eyedol player. These are habits that you might be building as an Eyedol player and might be doing kind of like subconsciously, since some of his options are very strong and very abusable, but sometimes you can get carried away with doing these things. And this is also for players who are fighting Eyedol and have trouble fighting like Eyedol players in general. These are some habits that you might want to look out for and take advantage of. So the first one is an overabuse of this normal here, jump medium kick. So the reason why Eyedol players love this normal so much is because warrior jump arc is very hard to contest. It's definitely not floaty at all. He falls very fast to the ground. He falls in this very tight arc. So if an Eyedol player is doing this to you, it's actually kind of hard to contest. And in addition, jump medium kick is just an absolutely massive button. So you will see idle players who base their entire neutral just around doing this and jumping at you, just because idle is very hard to anti-air. Sounds like me, you gotta change, because this is not the way to play idle. Because, especially against a character here like Jago, a astute player that anti-airs you is going to take 18% off of you for doing this each time. So even though, yes, this is hard to contest, and yes, if your opponent isn't anti-airing you, go ahead and abuse it as much as you want until they start. If they start anti-airing you, you have to have a plan in neutral. You have to have a backup, because if you just do this all day, it's eventually not gonna work. I have beaten idle players whose entire neutral just revolve around doing this button, and then after I start anti-airing them, they're confused. They stand at this range, they don't know what to do, they maybe throw out an overhead or something. It's just, if you're doing this as an idle player, like constantly, even if you're getting anti-aired, just stop. You need to reassess, you need to ground your neutral, and you need to work on a way to get in other than doing this if you're consistently being punished for it. And if you're, again, a player on the other end, I promise you, idle players that are newer or, not as good are going to rely on this a lot. If you can anti-air them consistently, their neutral is going to be significantly impacted. So you're going to have to work on anti-airing this, because I think it's a really one of the key things to work on during fighting idle. So the next thing that I have is not using pips. Part of the reason why Eyedol is so strong is because his moves can be enhanced and his offense can be enhanced by doing command grab or telestrike and giving him pips. Like, for example, without pips, like during this area, Eyedol, has to jump or run at you or hit a big button to approach. But if I have pips, I can just do this. Well, nope, I just did medium shoulder from like mid-screen, and now you're dead. And now I'm super plus. What makes Eyedol's offense non-linear is the fact that he has warrior pips specifically. So you need to be using these very liberally, in my opinion. If you are not using these as much as you should start working on it and try to find ways to spice your offense using these dash cancels and run cancels. Because at the end of the day, Eyedol's offense in warrior mode is kind of somewhat linear. He primarily plays a strike-throw game because his overhead is fairly reactable. However, he doesn't play strike-throw anymore if you get warrior pips, because if you do that, then you get a left-right, you can do empty jump lows, you can make your overhead fairly safe. Like, for example, let me just set the opponent to auto-block and get a few pips here for warrior. You can make your overhead fairly safe, fairly, like, an actually decent tool in the neutral. See, this button is very big, but it's -4 and it's very reactable. However, if you have a pip, it becomes a lot better. It becomes an approach tool. So if you're an idle player, you need to be making advantage of warrior pips. And if you're someone fighting idle, you need to realize that if your opponent is not using warrior pips, his offense is primarily strike-throw. So you have far less to worry about than if you're fighting, like, for example, Arya, who has, a fairly safe vortex. The next thing is not as big as the other two, but it's still kind of a problem. It's using Light Destroyer up close. So Light Destroyer Spaced is actually kind of busted, just because it's very hard to shadow counter. It's fairly fast, and, it's 2 hits. It pushes your opponent a fair amount of way. It has a massive amount of range. It's safe. All these things in conjunction make Light Destroyer a very good neutral tool, just because it's very easy to just throw out and get some advantage. However, I see a lot of idle players using Light Destroyer like right here, and I kind of get it because it's only -1 or something like that, and it's hard to shadow counter. But if you're up close, why not do the other versions? Because medium is 0, so technically you can throw afterwards, and heavy is +1, which is what I like to do. So if you're using Light Destroyer up close really consistently, this is not something you want to be doing up super up close. Light Destroyer is something you primarily want to space out and harass opponents with in neutral to poke them, and to catch them maybe mashing or being a little antsy. You shouldn't really be using it right here. I will notice players doing this, and especially astute players, if they notice this, they're going to challenge you fairly consistently, and even shadow counter it if you do it up that close. The speed is not going to work in your favor forever. So to sum that up, if you're an idle player, try to using Light Destroyer spaced instead of like right in their grill. And if you're someone fighting Eyedol, make sure that you challenge your opponent if they're using Light Destroyer super close to you, because they cannot press buttons here because they're -1. Okay. So next thing that I want to talk about primarily applies to Mage mode, and that is overuse of Telestrike. So Telestrike is very good and very hard to react to, even though it's like 32 frames startup, 32 frame startup, sorry, because it's a left-right. So it is fairly hard to react to consistently, just because there is an element where Eyedol can just do neutral Telestrike and teleport right in front of you. However, I promise you, if you overuse this, good players will catch on to it, and they will punish you for doing it. Especially good players can react to this every time, if they're looking for it, and the risk-reward is really not in your favor. If you hit them, you get a pip and something like maybe 2, 3, 1% or something like that. But if they block it and you get punished for it, it's super minus, so you're going to get punished really hard. So I know it's tempting to use this like very often because it's so hard to like react to in neutral if you're not used to it. However, the risk reward is not in your favor against an opponent that is consistently looking for it and consistently react to it. So if you're an Eyedol player overusing this, you want to cool it. You want to make sure that you've conditioned your opponents to look for Meteor and Bolt Strike first, and save Telestrike for maybe a little bit later if they've been conditioned to just forward block, or maybe even throw in a couple of these instead of the forward Telestrike version to make an actual true left-right. However, if you're a player on the other hand who's fighting Eyedol, you want to make sure you can like lab this and punish it, even though labbing Eyedol is kind of a pain in the ass, which is something I'll talk about a little later. Because if you can consistently manage to react to this, Mage's neutral becomes considerably less scary. Because at full screen normally he has a full mix-up. He has a high-low and he has a left-right. But if you can nullify Telestrike consistently against an opponent that is not conditioning you for it otherwise, then his neutral primarily becomes based around doing chip damage and keeping you away. And he loses that left-right if you can manage to look out for it and react to the 32 frame startup. Number 5. Not looking for Shadow Counter and Instinct. Okay, so this is what I mean by that. Shadow countering Eyedol and Instinct is traditionally very dangerous because he has a lot of frames where just you can't shadow counter. Especially during Shadow Crushing Destroyer, it tends to be the case that if you try to shadow counter Shadow Crushing Destroyer in Instinct, you end up not being able to because, you know, instead of just like 5 straight hits, it's like completely active during the entire time. So Eyedol has a lot of moves. This as well, Stomp Strikes. These are all very difficult to shadow counter. However, there is something you can do. After an Eyedol player does a special like this, or does Stomp Strike, you can shadow counter after it. Because chances are, if your opponent, and if you're fighting the Eyedol player, and they're, you know, doing something like this, they're going to probably feel safe to press a button afterwards, because a lot of people playing Eyedol, or fighting Eyedol, understand that one of the best counterplay against Eyedol's Instinct is just to kind of like block all of it out. But if you're consistently letting Eyedol get away with just like pressing buttons after every single after every single special, then you should be looking for a shadow counter, because that's really going to throw the Eyedol opponent off guard. And in addition, if you're an Eyedol player, you might want to look out for shadow counters, because a lot of like really good players will think like, okay, he's done heavy Stomp Strike, it's like +3 or +5, and he's fairly close to me. Chances are the opponent, or my opponent, Eyedol, is going to frame trap me with a button next, or do Light Destroyer for the 800th time, or Heavy Destroyer for the 800th time, which is shadow counterable on the first hit if you block something else before. So, to sum that up, if you're an Eyedol player, look out for shadow counters from the opponent, because you're not always going to be able to push this plus pressure for free if your opponent has resources and awareness. And if you're the person fighting Eyedol, make sure that you're shadow countering after specials to check the Eyedol players for pushing their plus frames too much. And I only have one more thing. The final thing, it's not super important, but it is something to look out for, is that a lot of Eyedol players will over-abuse light DP. especially as offense even, just because a meteor comes afterward, but it's hard to punish, and it's hard to punish. But I would not recommend doing this just because a lot of characters actually have some characters have a meterless punish. A lot of characters can just punish just by blocking and then doing a shadow projectile invulnerable special. So this is not really a super viable tool for offense if your opponent is like really looking out for it. A lot of idle players additionally will like to abuse this on defense because they think that, you know, oh, a meteor is coming, my opponent is not going to punish. And shadow meteors as well because, you know, a bunch of meteor comes down and it's hard to punish. But if your opponent is especially aware and they have resources like Instinct and Meter, and especially if they're a character like Khan Ra or General Rom that has a very long projectile invulnerable shadow command grab while the active frames are happening or after you get hit by it, they're going to punish you for it. So if you're you can throw a couple of these in just to mess up your opponent, but if your opponent is like looking for it and you've been abusing this a lot, this is not a super viable option for offense, and it's definitely not a safe DP. I don't think I can stress that enough. If you think that this is a completely safe DP, you are wrong, because an especially aware opponent is going to use their projectile invulnerable shadow to blow right through this and punish you for it. And there are some characters that even have punishes that are not meterless. I mean, like I believe if I do this like right in your face, Glacius can just do heavy shoulder and then he's out and he'll punish you. So that is the last thing. Just make sure if you're an idle player, try not to use this too much. Just treat it as a normal DP, especially if your opponent has shadow resources. And if you're the opponent fighting idle, make sure to look out for this, because this is a telltale sign that the idle player has not had this punished before, and they're just using it because they don't think that it's punishable. So those are the things that you should be looking out for, both as an idle player and as the player fighting idle. So if you've watched this far to the end of the video, I really appreciate you. I really respect your commitment to playing this character if you've watched the entire video, and I hope you do really good things, and I hope this guide has helped you. If you skip just to the end as well, I think that's totally fine. If you just want the basic like rundown, that's totally good. This is what I'm going to do in the conclusion here. I'm just going to summarize some quick pros and cons about this character and if you should play them or not. So the pros to Eyedol are, in my opinion, he has the best instinct in the game. He is a tool for basically anything. Those two are on chaos.infil.net's pros and cons for Eyedol. He has suffocating neutral. He sticks to the opponent like glue, and he has obnoxious plus frames. I've talked basically about all of these things already in my guide, but to just summarize, Eyedol is extremely good at just sticking to the opponent really closely, to utilizing really obnoxious plus frames and really good normals. This goes for in mage form as well. I'm in using it right now, but this goes for mage form as well, just because of things like Meteor Strike and Bolt Strike and Stomp Strike. Eyedol is extremely good at just sticking to the opponent when he gets in and playing a really obnoxious, aggressive strike throw game. Again, he has the best instinct thing in the game. If you just block it out, Eyedol will at least get a lot of chip damage and a lot of plus frames and a lot of meter. And if you get hit, you're going to get hit really hard because Eyedol Instinct does a lot of damage. Tool for anything, I mean, obviously he has a rushdown form with really good offense and a mage form with really good zoning. So obviously, if you want a tool for any kit, if you want a kit that has basically all the tools that you need, if you want to zone, you can do that. If you want to play really aggressive, obnoxious rushdown, you can do that too. And again, he does have obnoxious plus frames. A lot of his buttons are extremely plus. And in in things like Light Destroyer and Instinct, Heavy Stomp Strike, Crushing Destroyer and Instinct, all these things grant Eyedol like really obnoxious plus frames and Instinct. But in addition, in Warrior form and in Mage form, he just has really obnoxious plus frames as well. Like Stomp Strike being like +3, the Stand Medium Punches being 6 frames and +1, Light Destroyer only being -1, Heavy Destroyer being +1, things like that. And in addition to like Warrior Peps making his offense really safe and being able to force mix-ups and things, like being able to overhead from all the way over here and then do a high-low and mix-up. Like, generally, Eyedol has a lot of good ways to, like, force plus frames and take advantage of them really well and make his offense more tricky. So those are all the reasons I think why you should play Eyedol. And then I do have some cons here, surprisingly. He's very hard to lab, very annoying to lab. He does not have immediate access to high damage outside of Instinct. He does not have immediate access to a really punishing and damaging defense outside of Instinct. His offense without pips is somewhat linear, and he's not a pure zoner. So I'll go over these things really quickly. Eyedol is extremely frustrating to lab just because there is no option to like stay on a head that you want. You will just switch heads constantly. Like if you want to lab something in Warrior, you're going to have to be prepared to switch back to Warrior a lot. Same thing with Mage. The only time when Eyedol is not annoying to lab is in Instinct, and even that's kind of annoying because obviously there's no option in KI and in training to like give yourself unlimited pips. So if you want to lab Eyedol, you're going to have to be doing a lot of switching back and forth between bodies and a lot of manually reloading of pips, which can be very annoying at times. So if you don't like doing that, you know, if you want to be labbing all the time with no hiccups, maybe this is not a character for you. He has no immediate access to high damage outside of Instinct. Outside of Instinct, Eyedol's damage is actually fairly middling. His damage in Mage is actually fairly low just because it's compensated by his massive neutral control, and he doesn't really do very high damage in Mage form. In Warrior form, his damage is okay. I think it's about average, maybe a little bit above average, but it's generally not like as high as other characters. It's definitely not low, but it's not like fantastic either. You're gonna have to wait till Instinct to get that. No immediate access to high damage defense. His damage that he gets on even Shadow DP and Light DP are fairly low. The damage he gets on Shadow Bolt Strike is not very high. And the damage he gets and the reward he gets off of back Telestrike is not great either. The damage is really low. His reversal is like 32 frames, and back Telestrike doesn't do a lot of damage. So if you want like a Jago DP kind of defense, then this character might not be for you, just because you're going to have to suffice with like having fairly low damage on your reversals. However, he does have pretty good backdash, but that obviously doesn't do damage, and I'm talking about having a high damaging defense. If you want a high damaging defense, you might want to play someone like Jago, who does like 18% on counter hit heavy DP, but you probably don't want to play Eyedol for that. Outside of pips, his damage primarily comes from strike throw, which is fairly linear. Of course, Eyedol's offense is made a lot better by pip cancels, but if you don't want to take advantage of that and you're not really that great with resource management, even though these resources aren't super hard to get, Eyedol plays a fairly linear strike throw game. His overhead is fairly reactable, and if you start getting anti-aired off of these jump arcs, he primarily relies on shimmying you, trying to catch you mashing, having that really basic strike throw game, which is good. It's totally fine, but it's not like as aggressive and as tricky as something like Arya's offense or like Rash's tongue setups on hard knockdown or Shin. If you want offense that's like really tricky and you want to be able to set up really tricky left rights without resources, then you might want to play one of those characters. But as far as Eyedol goes, if you want that tricky offense, you're going to have to get pips. In addition, he's not a pure zoner. If you're looking primarily just to play a pure zoning character, this character is not really for you. Just because even though if you're looking to play a fairly rushdown oriented game plan, you can actually do that because Mage's close range pressure is actually extremely good. But there are going to be times when you're like zoning in Mage offense. You're like, oh, I'm the happiest boy in the world. Look at all this pressure that I can do. Look at all these big buttons I can press. And then eventually, over time, you're just going to switch to Warrior. And you're going to be in this position where like, oh, I wanted to keep zoning, but now I'm stuck in Warrior, and you're going to have to damage yourself and let your opponent gain ground on you to zone again. So you can play a fairly rushdown oriented Eyedol, but if you want to play a fairly keep away zone element to this character, and even though you can play Warrior Eyedol kind of lame, you can't really play him like very zony. So if you want a pure zoner, you're going to have to try to find a different character like Kilgore, who is primarily focused on zoning, because this character does primarily have a lot of plus frames and ways to orient a really good offense, and if you want to play Eyedol, you have to be able to do both. So thank you for watching my Eyedol guide. I hope it was thorough and informative, and I hope it was helpful. Obviously, you can see my gamer tag there, DingusConXI. I'm definitely not the best Eyedol in the world. I'm not even a great Eyedol player, but I definitely know my way around this character. If you want advice, you can just message me on the Windows 10 app or Xbox or whatever. For games, I'll probably be up for it if I'm not doing work or working or in school or whatever during that time. And if you want to ask me for advice, of course, I'm on the KI Discord as well, which you can do too. And I'm available for help. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope this was helpful for you.